Hey everyone, my name is Elizabeth Nash. My presentation is about Bolivia. So the picture of the mountain in the background is actually Mount Sajama. It's the highest peak in Bolivia, and it's beautiful. So I thought I would share it. So this is Bolivia's flag. It's also known as the tricolor. All of those stripes are symmetrical, and they're all equal size. The top stripe, the red one, stands for valor and bravery of Bolivian soldiers. The green one symbolizes the terrain, and the middle yellow stripe symbolizes Bolivia's mineral resources and wealth, sorry. And in the very center of the flag on the yellow stripe is the national coat of arms. So, the map of Bolivia shows how Bolivia is landlocked by Brazil, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Paraguay. The capital of Bolivia is La Paz, and let's see, it's in the middle left if you're looking at the right picture. And they also have a second capital, which is named Sucre, and it's named after the first president of Bolivia, and it's also where they have their Supreme Court. And another interesting fact about La Paz is that it is the world's highest capital city at 3,600 meters high. And the wealthy get to live in the lower elevations where it's more comfortable. The less wealthy have to live higher up in elevation where the air is really thin. So it's harder to breathe and move around and do stuff. Some economics of Bolivia. They have a pretty big population. It's approximately 9.12 million people, and 1.5 million of those are right around and in La Paz. So they have a big industry that includes mining, which is usually in a tin mine. They used to have silver mines, but they moved it up to tin because all the silver ones collapsed. They had to close them down. It's done by residents of the rural areas. They also do smelting, petroleum, food, and beverages. The agriculture is one of their biggest resources, and this includes the soybean farming, coffee, coca plant growing, cotton, and timber. And their exports include the soybeans, natural gas, zinc, gold, and wood. The history of Bolivia is pretty interesting because Bolivia really didn't get off on the greatest start in the world. In ancient times, which was around 400 BC, the Spaniards, specifically led by Simon Bolivar, conquered the area, which had already been civilized by people of Bolivia who had been living there for hundreds of years prior, and he founded the city of Tijuana. And in the colonial Bolivia time frame, the Spaniards founded more cities such as the Chuquisaca, La Paz, Cochabamba, and Oruro. The Indians then were forced to work in the mines, and many of them died, and they died from disease too. And then they were just pissed off, so they decided to attempt a rebellion against the Spaniards, which ultimately failed because the Spaniards greatly outnumbered the Indians. However, another rebellion in 1809, led by the Indians, obviously, resulted in La Paz declaring Indian independence from the Spaniards, and then conjoined with Bolivia in 1825. And there they had their first president, General Sucre. So Sucre decided that he wanted to try and unite with Peru, and then the Chileans felt threatened, so they had this big war called the War of the Confederation, which ultimately ended the Union, and that was that. So in 1879, Bolivia decided to increase their taxation on Chilean-owned nitrate companies, which naturally started another war called the War on the Pacific, and resulted in Bolivia using this nice strip of coast, which ultimately made them landlocked. And luckily, in the 19th century, right at the end of it, the silver industry in Bolivia was revived with help by capital from Britain and Chile, along with technology. So they made a comeback. So in the 20th century, it was really just all about wars, rebellions, coups, and revelations for Bolivia. They lost power to Bolivian liberals, then got it back via conservatives. Then they fought a war with Paraguay, only to be taken over by radicals, who launched a revolution and regained power to Bolivia. So by the time the 21st century rolled around, the economy had grown significantly. And Bolivia now has a new president whose name is Evo Morales. He's down there in the left picture. And presently, Bolivia remains a really poor country, but it's very rich in resources, and tourism is one of those great resources. So the social makeup of Bolivia revolves predominantly around religion. About 95% of the country is Roman Catholic, and the leftover 5% is Protestant. The ethnicities that make up Bolivia are, for the most part, Indian, which are either Quechua or Aymara, and the rest are mixed ethnicities. The official language is Spanish, but there are a couple other dialects. And the demographics of Bolivia are that it's in Central South America, it's southwest of Brazil, and it's surrounded by Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Paraguay. So the social relations inside of Bolivia are for the most part centered on family and friends. The family is the access of the social life and structure, and most of the families are huge. The marriages take place at a young age. There is traditional dating where the parents either know the potential suitor or their family, or they get to know the suitor before they're allowed to date their child. And the women of Bolivia have a lower social status than the men, but they are seen as very important in business and trade activities such as street vending. Primary education is available to all the Bolivian children, and there are government-funded universities for those who qualify, which are obviously the more wealthy, as well as private universities for those that can afford it. However, as a primary education, the economic factors of the family depend on their wealth and location. So a lot of kids don't get that education because they just don't have access to a school. And in the rural population, which would be these kids, the poverty-stricken ones, which are in the countryside and the lowland, they don't get an education because they just simply can't access it. And they don't have accessibility to the job industry or the trade market. So they just end up living their lives out there doing the farming and growing the coca plants. So in the towns, the job industry is a little bit better for people who have the education and accessibility to the trade market. The jobs here include the street vendors, construction workers, the maids and housekeepers, the plumbers, electricians, or the carpenters. And then the middle class is seen as the more wealthy or the elite class, where the education is advanced and there are better opportunities. And these are seen as the professionals in the job world. They're the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, and the technicians of different varieties, which were all those. So sports also play a big part in the social relation of Bolivia. There are many professional sports teams, including basketball, volleyball, and soccer teams. The most popular sport is soccer, and the matches are held in a few stadiums. The best known stadium, which is the picture on the right, is the Hernando Siles Stadium in the city of La Paz. And the president, Evo Morales, is often an attendant to the games, and he even plays sometimes himself, and just to get publicity, he'll hang out with the players. And there are quite a few current and regional issues in Bolivia. The most pressing problem is the issue of poverty, with about 60% of Bolivians living below the national poverty line. And this percentage is, of course, higher for the rural areas, where 3 out of 4 people live in poverty. And in the indigenous areas, the women and the young people are particularly vulnerable to poverty. So in the rural areas, there's a lack of job opportunities and poor natural resource management practices, as well as limited access to basic services such as the primary education, health, and sanitation. Which leads us to another current issue happening in Bolivia, which is the cocaine industry. The Bolivian indigenous people have been growing and consuming the coca leaf for like thousands of years. So there's a big rising demand for cocaine in the United States, and it's restructuring their economy rapidly because Bolivia produces approximately 40 to 50% of the world's supply of coca leaf and coca paste. And the Chapar tropical rainforest area in the department of Cochabamba alone supplies 70% of the nation's coca leaf crop. So this is a big problem because cocaine is being trafficked into the United States as well as other countries at an increased rate. So it's producing enough money for the rural and indigenous areas to survive on. So it's going to keep inflating, and they're going to keep growing it, despite efforts of programs to increase the use of farming crops through crop substitution. So for things like rice, bananas, maize, citrus, and pineapples, more small farmers are opting to grow coca leaves instead because the amount of income is substantially greater. Which brings us to the next issue of poverty, to President Morales, who just recently, a couple weeks ago, won this year's election to become president for another term. And he's the country's first president with indigenous roots, so that makes him very popular among the rural and indigenous population. and he's successfully managed to grow the economy at a healthy rate. He's shrunk inequality. He's reduced the number of people living in poverty significantly, so he's pretty popular with the rural area. The problem is that he may have a prolonged term of power if he's elected again, and he's with the new generation of Caudillos being anti-American. So the engagement on development, military cooperation, and drug enforcement efforts will be very limited because they don't want to work with us. And lawmakers are going to see this as a problem because the pattern of prolonged power is unhealthy for the region and enables the leaders to appoint allies to electoral and judicial bodies and build patronage networks that turn out the vote. So no matter what happens, if he has the right allies, he's always going to win. So he's going to keep on being in term. So another little thing that I found interesting is the death road, which is in Bolivia. And as you can see, it's moderately terrifying. I would not want to be stuck on that road coming head on with another bus. And you can see the cross. There's tons of crosses all along the road where people have fallen off and there have been accidents. And just quite frankly, the fog freaks me out anyways, and I don't really want to go there. Even though this is a huge tourist destination, you can see the bus in the bottom right corner has the bike on top, is because a lot of bikers and marathon bikers like to come there as a vacation essentially and bike on the death road just to say they did it. And I'm going to say no to that. I don't want to do that. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation on Bolivia. Hope you learned a couple interesting facts like I did. And that's about it. Don't do cocaine.